Timur the Lame, also known as Tamerlane, was one of the greatest and most brutal conquerors in all of history. Over the course of his storied 44-year military career, he never lost a major battle and left 17 million dead in his wake, a grand total of 5.4% of the entire living population on Earth at that time. From his base in Central Asia, his endless wars brought him as far as modern-day Ukraine, India, and finally Anatolia, where he would see his greatest triumph. This is the story of history's last great nomadic conqueror, a man who many would come to call the Prince of Destruction. Timur was born in 1336, a member of a Turco-Mongolic steppe tribe named the Barlas, their pastures being located about 50 miles south of the city of Samarkand. In the grand scheme of things, Timur was a nobody, or at least he should have been. His name, however, connected him to none other than Chinggis Khan. Timur means iron. Chinggis Khan's original name, Temujin, means exactly the same in Mongolian. Not much is recorded of Timur's early life, but we can presume that he grew up in the harshness that is the Eurasian steppe, a life of constant movement, grazing hordes of horses, and becoming an expert hunter. Timur was just another nomadic face in an ocean of grass and yurts. He didn't come onto the political scene until the age of 24. The Chagatai Khaganate, who the Barlas were subservient to, had been plunged into civil war. The Chagatai were one of the successor states left behind by the Mongolian Empire after their disintegration. Internal conflict as of late had plagued the descendants of the Great Khan, and in 1347 the eastern portion of the Chagatai Khaganate seceded and started governing themselves as Mogulistan, under their new Khan, Tughluq. In 1360, Tughluq would invade the Chagatai with hopes of reunifying the Khaganate under himself. When news reached the Barlas chief that Tughluq was approaching, he simply packed his bags and ran in the opposite direction. A few members of the Barlas stayed behind, chief among them being Timur. Tughluq succeeded in conquering the remnants of the Chagatai. Timur used this opportunity to grasp at power for himself. He met with Tughluq, pledging his allegiance to him, and in turn, he named Timur as the new chief of the Barlas tribe, giving him an advisory role to his son, Ilyas, who would be the new governor of the conquered Chagatai Khaganate. Conflict quickly arose between Ilyas and Timur over what we don't exactly know. In response, Timur decided to rebel against Mogulistan in 1361, joining the side of a not yet subdued Chagatai nobleman named Hussein. To cement their alliance, Timur married Hussein's sister, as the pair began to fight tooth and nail against Ilyas and his eastern horde. The going was rough for the two rebels. They barely had any manpower to recruit from, and resorted to stealing livestock from the common folk just to get by. The pair did find small-scale success conducting guerrilla warfare on Ilyas's army, but in many ways, Timur and Hussein were just bandits. But the ends were supposed to justify their means. By 1363, their situation had become dire, as they failed to defeat any of the Mogulistan armies in an open battle. On a raid set to capture much-needed food from a local tribe, Timur would come face to face with death. Before Timur's party could escape with their looted animals, a few horsemen appeared to deter these bandits. Timur began to run, but took an arrow to the knee, as well as in the hand. He was then left for dead by his men. Miraculously, Timur dragged his bloodied body to safety and rejoined his small band of marauders. The consequences were extreme, and he lost 2 fingers on his right hand. Not only this, but Timur's leg never recovered, and he would walk with a limp for the rest of his life, thus trademarking his title of Timur the Lame. One may think that this would make Timur appear more weak, and that he might take a break from adventuring. However, this only served to strengthen Timur's name on the steppe, making the man all the more terrifying to his enemies. After recovering from his wounds, Timur decided to put his new reputation to the use. Tamerlane and a small band decide to finally confront Ilyas in a traditional battle, or what Ilyas thought would be a traditional battle. The night before the confrontation, Timur ordered the burning of hundreds of campfires, suggesting that his force was much larger than it actually was. In the morning, he chose his battlefield expertly, picking flat ground with arid, almost sandy land. With this force outnumbered multiple times over, Timur decided to keep using psychological warfare to boost his number. He tied leafy branches to the legs of all of his horses, kicking up sand and dust as they thundered towards their foe. This served to scare Ilyas's army as they soon lost hope and began to retreat. Timur chased this fleeing army and slaughtered many of them before the day was over. With Hussein and Timur's first large-scale victory won, the two leaders consolidated their control over the rest of the Chagatai Khaganate, as Ilyas retreated to Mogulistan. With this, Hussein named himself as the Emir of Chagatai, while Timur served as the lead general and governor of Samarkand. Hussein, being a descendant of the Great Khan, was the head of this dual rebellion, as his reign was looked on as much more legitimate than an upstart Barlash chief. While their rebellion had ousted Ilyas from Chagatai, he still lived and started to rebuild his army in hopes of reclamation. In 1363, Ilyas succeeded his father as Khan of Mogulistan, and he would return to Chagatai in 1365, again with a massive army that outnumbered Timur's multiple times over. Despite this, Timur would meet Ilyas on the battlefield, and this time, the Barlash chief would be defeated for the final time in his military career. With the path to Samarkand open, Ilyas besieged the city as Timur sent word to Hussein for reinforcement. What Hussein sent to his best general was nothing more than a small raiding party, and he never left the walls of his capital to defend his second largest city. Despite having no support from Hussein, Samarkand held out, as the siege faltered in a few months and Ilyas returned to Mogulistan. Chagatai's position had been secured, of course with absolutely no help from Emir Hussein. Timur's beloved city had almost been taken. He would surely not forget this inaction. Hussein was not only absent in protecting his realm, but he also laid heavy taxes on his people, who soon began to despise him. In turn, especially in the north of Chagatai, people started to favor Timur more than the emir himself. In 1366, Hussein's sister, and Timur's wife, died. While taking her body to be buried in bulk, Timur entered the city and was met by many applauses, thus signifying a start to a rivalry between the two longtime brother-in-laws. Timur returned to Samarkand and Hussein returned to exploiting his own people. Eventually, by 1370, Timur had enough of his subservience and entered into an open rebellion. Hussein, as he had shown previously, was eager to hide behind his walls while Timur did all the fighting. Eventually, Timur took the city of Balkh and deposed Hussein, executing him shortly after. In his place, Timur named himself as the Emir of Chagatai, but not before marrying the wife of the headless Hussein, Sarai Khanum, a direct descendant of Chinggis Khan himself. She would remain a steadfast advisor for the remainder of Timur's life. After rising from bandit to emir, Timur returned to Samarkand, naming the city that could be described as the next closest thing to his hometown as his capital. While Timur was now a self-proclaimed emir, he was still the son of a nobody in a small and forgotten tribe. To solidify a sense of legitimacy in the lands that he claimed as his own, he appointed a descendant of the great Chinggis Khan himself as the new Khan of Chagatai. This shrewd political move would guarantee the legitimacy of Timur's reign in the eyes of his Turco-Mongolic subjects. But make no mistake, this new Khan was simply a puppet, completely under the control of Emir Timur. Timur consolidated his newly won realm over the next 2 years, before he began the military campaigns that he would one day become so notorious for. Just as the old Mongolian Empire had started their conquest of Iran and Khwarezm, so too would Timur the Lame. In 1372, Timur invaded Khwarezm, going to the first city in his path. He sacked and looted it, killing all men and taking the women and children as hostages. This was a precursor to the dark cloud that was about to shadow all the Middle East. Having shown that the sword was being brought down onto him, The leader of Khwarezm came to a deal with Emir Timur. He would keep the western half of his lands along the Caspian Sea and rule as a vassal subject, all while Timur subjugated the eastern half of Khwarezm and added it to his own growing empire. And just as Timur appeared to burst onto the scene, he halted his conquests for nearly a decade. Perhaps he felt some level of guilt putting an entire city to the sword, or maybe Timur simply wanted peace after leading a life consumed by warfare. Another explanation for this pause in Timur's otherwise endless campaigns is the death of his son, Jahangir Mirza, who passed away in 1376. It is reported that Timur was grief-stricken and entered into a period of long mourning. But just as one son died, another appeared before him. While it was not his true son, Timur would consider this man, named Tokhtamysh, as his understudy. Tokhtamysh was a descendant of the Great Khan and a contested ruler of the White Horde that controlled the land just north of Timur. Tokhtamysh's father was killed by the Khan of the newly created Golden Horde that had unified both the White Horde and the Blue Horde. Tokhtamysh never forgave him, starting multiple campaigns to avenge his father, all proving to be failures. In 1376, just as Jahangir died, Tokhtamysh arrived, one missing a father, the other a son. Perhaps this is why Timur brought him into his court and agreed to support his ticket as Khan of the White Horde. Timur gave him soldiers and money to begin his reconquest of the White Horde. Tokhtamysh established himself at a few key strongholds between the Caspian and Aral seas. The Khan of the Golden Horde, Urus, immediately sent out one of his sons to deal with the troublesome Tokhtamysh. The prince managed to defeat the pretender, but at the cost of his own life. Tokhtamysh returned to Timur once more, and in turn, he granted him more men and resources. Tokhtamysh re-established himself between the two seas and started conducting raids deep into the Golden Horde. Khan Urus sent another son south, this one managing to defeat Tokhtamysh without dying. Instead, it was Tokhtamysh who nearly died, only escaping by fleeing across the Sri Darya River. The defeated Tokhtamysh returned to Timur, this time with the more pressing issue. A Golden Horde army was in hot pursuit, and if he didn't act soon, they could conquer Timur's small khanate. In short time, the diplomats arrived in Samarkand, demanding Tokhtamysh be handed over to them. Timur refused to do so, hereafter gathering a sizable army for the first time in 4 years. In the winter of 1376 and 1377, Timur led his own army to consolidate Tokhtamysh's rule over the southern Golden Horde. Here, the Prince of the Golden Horde and Tamerlane maneuvered their armies around each other for 3 months, each attempting to gain a strategically favorable position on the other. With Timur proving to be a much harder man to catch than Tokhtamysh, the Golden Horde army retreated. Soon after this, Khan Orus died, and with this, Timur officially declared Tokhtamysh as the new Khan of the White Horde. It would take this young Khan 3 years to defeat the other sons of Orus and establish his authority over the entirety of the Golden Horde. While Timur was on his brief campaign, his vassal subject in Khwarezm took the opportunity to revolt. Timur veered his undamaged army south and arrived before the walls of the rebel stronghold city of Originz in 1377. Once arriving, the leader of the revolt challenged Timur to single combat. Timur, who, might I remind you, holds the nickname of the Lame, accepted. When he approached the walls, only accompanied by his sword, the rebel leader quickly changed his mind and chose not to face the battle-hardened Emir. Soon after, this rebel grew ill and died, leaving his city to face the wrath of Tamerlane. Originz was sacked and left in ruin, with women and children being taken as slaves. For the next 4 years, Timur continued supporting Tokhtamysh and returned to his irregular peace. Soon enough, he grew tired of this and turned to the many sultans, shahs, and emirs of Iran to expand his realm. In the wake of the Mongolian invasions of Iran, the conquerors created their own state in the region called the Ilkhanate. This didn't even last for a century until the nomadic conquerors converted to Islam and settled down, leading to a weakening of the realm and its eventual disintegration. Succeeding the Ilkhanate was a host of many quarreling nations, all trying to gain supremacy over Iran. In 1380, Timur demanded that his neighbors, the Khartid dynasty, surrender to him. When they rejected, the Timurid army marched on the Khartid capital of Herat. Here, Timur took the city and gave it the usual punishment of complete destruction. Herat wouldn't be rebuilt for some 30 years. After showing what befalls those who do not surrender, the rest of the Khartid realm fell to Timur without so much as a fight. Following this, Timur turned west to the realm of the Sarbadars. Infighting had already consumed them for some time, leaving them weak and in no position to oppose Emir Timur. Hearing of the reputation that preceded Tamerlane, they surrendered without a fight in 1382, and were treated respectfully in turn. With his initial push into Persia proving a massive success, Timur returned to Samarkand, enriching his capital with the wealth earned on his campaign. Here he remained for a little over a year before gathering a new army and marching into Iran once again. Timur turned his attention west to the prosperous land of the southern Caspian Sea coast known as Mazandaran. Here he captured the key city of Touraine with no fight, subduing the region. Going west still, Timur entered the lands of the Jalurid dynasty, the most powerful of the Ilkhanate's successor states, and home to one of Timur's most irritating rivals, Sultan Ahmad Jalayir. Unlike the other minor Iranian players, Ahmad Jalayir refused to surrender to Timur, dooming himself and his country to complete destruction. The Timurid army captured the Jalurid capital of Tabriz, its population being put to the sword. Timur probably would have continued conquering the rest of the Jalurid realm, but he was forced to return to his core territories. Another revolt had broken out in Khwarezm that threatened Samarkand itself. By 1385, Timur had made the long journey back to Khwarezm, defeating the rebels and plundering the city of Urgench for the second time. Timur destroyed the walls of the city, and for the defenders who had once manned those walls, he allowed them to continue their defense forever. Timur had a new wall erected and cemented the rebels into the foundation. While Timur was absent from Iran, Ahmad Jalayir attempted to retake Tabriz, to no avail. In that same year of 1385, another army arrived before the walls of Tabriz, not one of the many Iranian states. Instead, it was the Khan of the Great Golden Horde, Tokhtamysh. The man who Timur had helped so much was now showing signs of his true ambitions. Tokhtamysh sacked Tabriz just as his mentor had. Timur responded by sending an army to recapture Tabriz, but by the time they arrived in 1386, Tokhtamysh was long gone. Instead of ignoring this insult to his authority, Timur decided to take action, marching north and in the direction of the Golden Horde. Timur conquered much of modern-day Azerbaijan, setting up a second front with the Golden Horde. Going west along the Caucasus mountain range, Timur soon arrived on the doorstep of the Kingdom of Georgia. In the times before the Great Mongolic Horde, Georgia had created a vast empire in the Caucasus and beyond. But after the Mongolians conquered Georgia, it was left to only its core territories, leaving it as a small Christian state in a sea of Islamic nations. Seeking to rile his people up against these heathens, Timur declared himself the defender of Islam, and directed his wrath onto the Georgians. At this time, Georgia was under the rule of King Bagrat V, a man described not only as a generous ruler, but also an excellent general. No matter how good of a commander that Bagrat may have been, he was forced to deal with insurmountable odds. Timur's massive horde could not be stopped in open battle, so Bagrat fell behind the walls of his capital, Tbilisi. The walls of the old city held out for a few months before they finally fell on November 22nd of 1386. What followed was a massacre of the Christian and Muslim population alike, showing that the defender of Islam may not be what he seemed. King Bagrat V and most of his family were captured and brought back to Samarkand, where they were forced to convert to Islam. During this time, Bagrat's son, George, retook Georgia and styled himself as King George VII. Timur sent the converted Bagrat back to Georgia with a host of 12,000 to reclaim his throne as a vassal of the Timurid Empire. As the army approached Tbilisi, they were ambushed by Bagrat's son, who annihilated his father's 12,000-man escort. Bagrat had, without the knowledge of his captors, wrote to his son and helped orchestrate this ambush. With the independence of Georgia reclaimed, Bagrat V renounced Islam and secured an alliance with Tokhtamysh, thus concluding the first of Timur's 8 separate invasions of Georgia. With 2 subjects now betraying and aligning themselves against him, Timur marched west. Going along the same route through Mazandaran, he arrived in modern-day Azerbaijan by 1387. With his alliance to Georgia, Tokhtamysh had already started making moves into the eastern Caucasus. Despite this, Timur continued his march on Tbilisi. With help from their new ally, the Georgians managed to hold off Timur's army for some time before he was forced to withdraw. He probably could have reconquered Georgia if not for Tokhtamysh making serious headway in Azerbaijan. Timur turned his army to defeat his old ally, which he did with ease. With the Georgian campaign stalled, Timur moved south, not to conquer, but to simply claim his inheritance. The ruler of the Muzaffarid dynasty, who controlled lands along the coast of the Persian Gulf, had left his nation to Tamerlane in his will. This was a wise choice to submit to the great conqueror in order to preserve the life of his family. However, not all of his sons agreed with this choice. The eldest of these boys refused his father's will and took control of the capital at Esfahan. When Timur arrived there in 1387, his grand host of horsemen convinced the son to surrender without a fight, leaving what would have been his kingdom to Tamerlane. With the Muzaffarid dynasty subdued, Timur continued in his real goal for this campaign, the reconquest of Georgia. But before he could make serious gains, he would again be forced to withdraw. The Muzaffarid that had submitted to him started to rebel. To secure this new gain, Timur marched south and did what he should have done in the first place. A ruler who reigns through fear alone needs to show his dominance. Thus, he sacked the cities of the Muzaffarids, massacring their populations. The city of Esfahan would suffer the most, with 70,000 lying dead in their treachery. With the Muzaffarid realm being reduced to ash, Timur probably restarted his march on Tbilisi, and just like before, he would never get there. In the east, an old friend threatened the heart of the Timurid realm. This was, of course, Tokhtamysh. Tokhtamysh was proving to be a nuisance in the sight of Timur, but in 1387 he took this conflict to a place where relations could never recover. Tokhtamysh invaded the Timurid Empire, not in the western theater this time, but in the east. He took the city of human walls in Urgench and marched on Samarkand itself. He even went as far as besieging Samarkand, although the walls of this steppe city held firm and persuaded Tokhtamysh to continue raiding more lightly defended settlements. This left the center of the Timurid realm in disarray, as many of the cities not conquered by Tokhtamysh began to rebel. Timur returned to Samarkand, and after fully grasping this situation, he moved to reconquer his lands. Starting with Urgench, the city of human walls was besieged, and for the third time, its civilian population was massacred. Maybe this time they would learn. Over the course of 2 more years, Timur and his army undid what Tokhtamysh had caused, reunifying the Timurid Empire as it had been by 1391. After reconsolidating his empire, Timur gathered an army and marched north to confront a man whom he had once mentored. Diplomats from the Golden Horde sought peace with Timur, but an attack on Samarkand was a bridge too far. The long road ahead of the army would be filled with rivers and plains, prime steppe for his horde of horses to graze. Going north from Samarkand, Timur went around the Aral Sea and turned west until reaching the next widest body of water, the Kundurcha River. Here, Tokhtamysh waited with his own army to defeat his erstwhile ally. The Battle of the Conqueror River started with Tokhtamysh attempting to flank the Timurid force with his cavalry. He was successful in this, but it also just walked into Timur's trap. While the Timurid flanks held their ground, the center of the army made for a huge push against Tokhtamysh himself. With both of their generals behind them, the center of the battlefield turned into a bloodbath. Eventually, Timur's middle broke Tokhtamysh's center, and the Khan of the Golden Horde began to flee, along with his entire army. Before Timur could get to Tokhtamysh, he had already escaped to the other side of the Conqueror River, along with much of his army. Timur had won the battle, but as long as Tokhtamysh was still alive, he would do anything to defeat his foes, no matter how many times he was defeated himself. Satisfied with this victory, Timur returned to Samarkand and arrived there in 1392. While he was gone, the pesky lands of the Muzaffarids revolted once more. Timur made his way there and dealt with the rebellion in quite possibly the cruelest display of power. He killed all civilians inside, and outside Esfahan, he left an unimaginable warning. Multiple teetering towers of skulls were left outside to bleach in the Persian sun. This convinced the rest of the rebellion to disperse in good time. After this dramatic display, Timur moved north to deal with his Iranian rival, Ahmad Jaliyir. From Esfahan, Timur moved towards Baghdad. The city, unsurprisingly, submitted to him without a fight. With the Jalirid premier city in his grasp, Timur continued taking the rest of the Sultanate with little resistance. The conquest would have been complete here if it was not for Sultan Ahmad Jaliyir, who retook Baghdad and the south of his realm in the absence of Emir Timur. Normally, Timur would have marched to Baghdad and massacred its population, but this was not the Prince of Destruction's major goal in this campaign. Timur was here to open up the other front with Tokhtamysh in the Caucasus and defeat him here like he had in the east. First on Timur's hit list was Tokhtamysh's ally in Georgia, the newly crowned King George VII. In 1394, Timur sent 4 generals to bring southern Georgia to the sword. After massacring the Kartvelians, Timur sent his son, Mirhan Shah, with an army to retake Tbilisi and capture its king. All while Timur continued north with the main army to confront Tokhtamysh and his allies in Chechnya. Mirhan Shah probably expected an easy victory, but was shown firsthand the stubbornness of the Georgians. After marching through the mountains, Mirhan besieged the city of Alinjak. King George VII marched there with an army and caught Mirhan Shah off guard. Here, the son of Timur was defeated and forced to rejoin with his father in Azerbaijan, marking the second of 2 Timurid armies that were defeated by King George VII. Of all Timur's rivals, none found more success than the King of Georgia. Timur subdued Tokhtamysh's Chechen ally by 1395, plundering the city of Derbent and everything north of that until reaching the Terek River. Here, at the banks of another river, Tokhtamysh prepared to meet Tamerlane. If to be believed, the armies were of near equal strength and numbered about 100,000 men each. Tokhtamysh opened the engagement by sending a vanguard of a few thousand to disrupt and distract the Timurid army away from the main advance. This was in turn met by Timur surrounding and killing most of them. The true battle on the Terek River started with Tokhtamysh ordering an advance on Timur's right flank and middle, hoping to turn the Timurid army and leave it exposed. The fight was grueling, and Timur even participated alongside his soldiers in the melee, almost meeting his end on multiple occasions. All the while, Tokhtamysh sat back and watched, waiting for his moment to retreat, as he always had. The battle raged on as a stalemate, and Tokhtamysh looked in hope for his army to come out on the other side. But Timur had sufficiently dug into the landscape, making his camp and fortifying it to suppress any advances from Tokhtamysh at night. The next morning, the 2 armies arrayed themselves for battle once more. Tokhtamysh opened the battle by sending his right flank to Timur's left. However, this was only a gambit, as Timur's left pursued their attackers and were led into a feigned retreat, whereafter they were surrounded and forced to flee the battle. With Tokhtamysh taking the first phase of the battle, he advanced on his foe's weakened army. Seeing this made Timur retreat back to the safety of his fortified camp, all while Tokhtamysh took to besieging the Timurid army for the better part of a day, before he was forced back by the approaching nightfall. The next day, the two armies went back to formations and stared at each other across the plain. This time, Tokhtamysh sent his left flank to subdue Timur's right. Once sufficiently baited, the Timurid flank fell back and dismounted their horses, standing behind them after placing stakes in the ground to prevent the Golden Horde cavalry to wreak havoc on the horseless archers. Behind their mounts, the archers let loose devastating volleys, while part of Timur's personal bodyguard charged and forced the Golden Horde left flank back. The two armies were matching each other in every way. The advantage would not be earned on the battlefield, but in treachery. After the day's engagement was over, Timur wrote to the leader of a tribe on Tokhtamysh's left flank, and when Tokhtamysh awoke the next morning, he found half of his left flank deserted from the field. This did not halt Tokhtamysh, but did serve to anger him. The next morning, he ordered an all-out charge on the Timurid army. However, with the weakened left flank, he was pushed back and nearly surrounded. Himself and the remnants of his army fled the field and escaped. Timur had defeated Tokhtamysh for the second time, but as always, he had escaped to fight another day. The Prince of Destruction did not turn back to Samarkand, but decided to make sure that Tokhtamysh and the Golden Horde as a whole would never be a threat to his empire ever again. What followed was a spree of massacres across the Golden Horde's most prosperous cities. From Astrakhan to Yelets, Timur's armies plundered their way across the heartland of the Golden Horde, leaving tens of thousands dead in their wake. Tokhtamysh and the Golden Horde would never recover from this complete sacking, and both would never pose a serious issue to Timur after this, especially after he installed a much more loyal puppet as the Khan of the Golden Horde. Tokhtamysh was likely Timur's greatest rival, not because he was the most powerful, but simply because he was partly trained by Timur himself, and knew the Emir well. While their alliance disintegrated into quarreling, I have taken the time to think about a world where Timur and Tokhtamysh were steadfast allies and what that might look like. And that world was terrifying. If these two nomadic conquerors had each other's total cooperation, then there's no telling what their destructive sum could have been. By 1396, Tamerlane started the long journey back to Samarkand, going through the South Caucasus and, for once in his life, deciding not to pillage and rape Georgia as he passed by it. Instead, Timur headed straight for the Jalurid Sultanate, retaking Baghdad and the south of Ahmad Jalir's land. From here, Sultan Ahmad retreated into the Ottoman Empire, seeking their aid against the nomadic conqueror. Timur went back to Samarkand, concluding 6 years of campaigning. He remained in his capital for about a year before returning to his life on the road. This time, his goal was not to campaign in the north or in the west, but in the southeast and into the Indian subcontinent. At this time, northern India was under the domain of the Delhi Sultanate, who had reigned supreme here for over 100 years. As of recently, however, the Sultanate had fell into internal conflict and a shrinking of its borders from outside powers grasping to take its place. India was ripe for conquest, and the intelligent conqueror could plainly see that. But first, Timur needed a reason to fight the Delhi Sultanate. In 1397, Timur's least favorite grandson, Pir Muhammad, was given land directly bordering the Delhi Sultanate. It's unknown what Pir Muhammad did to anger his grandfather, but Timur is known to have scolded him harshly on 2 separate occasions, if not more. This was a redemption campaign for Pir Muhammad, who followed Timur's orders and began raiding into India. The Delhi Sultanate, in turn, began raiding Timurid lands, giving Tamerlane all the reason he needed to invade. As 1397 turned into 1398, Pir Muhammad's raids escalated into full-scale invasion, sacking the border cities on the Indus River. All while Timur was making his way down to India with a massive army of some 80,000 Eurasian nomads. He arrived by the latter half of 1398, where he crossed the Indus River, and joined his grandson in pillaging the Delhi Sultanate. Timur met no opposition as he continued east toward the crown lands of Delhi itself. In his way, there was only one thing that could stop him: Batnar Fort. A structure thought to be impregnable. However, the fort was lightly defended, and Timur arrived there, seeking their submission. The fort's commander, trying to save his garrison, surrendered and left the safety of Batnar to confront the warlord. He gave up the fort to Timur, but soon after, found himself stranded in the middle of an enemy army. The defenders inside the fort refused to acknowledge their commander's surrender and closed the gates behind them. Hereafter, the garrison's leader was killed by Timur's men whilst his army descended on Batnar Fortress. What followed was a bloodbath. Inside the fort, the men killed all the women and children, saving them from the wrath of Tamerlane. The fort didn't hold out for long before the Timurid army stood tall on the walls of an impregnable fortress. With his only obstacle erased, Timur continued marching on the city of Delhi, and just outside the city he was confronted by the young Sultan and an army that numbered just as much as his. This Indian army was made complete by a grand host of elephants that sported chainmail armor and poison-tipped tusks. The battle outside the walls of Delhi would be one of Timur's greatest strategic feats over his career. He started the battle not by attacking his foe directly, but psychologically. He orchestrated his prisoners, numbering some tens of thousands, to be lined up in front of their sultan, and executed with no remorse. After this, Timur distracted the flanks of his enemy by sending his cavalry wings to harass the Indians with many feigned retreats. Once they were sufficiently engaged with Timur's wings, another portion of the Timurid cavalry swept into the forward cavalry of Delhi and crushed them. After this, Timur withdrew his army to realign, as they were at the start of the battle. Deposing of Delhi's forward cavalry left their most dangerous weapon, the elephants, completely exposed. After realigning his men, Timur ordered for a full-scale charge of his entire army. The flanks of Delhi fell first and were forced away from the battlefield, leaving the Sultan only with his infantry and elephants in the center. For the elephants, Timur had assembled huge caltrops that he placed all around them, and after setting the trap, Tamerlane sprung it by sending camels to panic the elephants. This proved utterly successful, as the Sultan's ace was torn from his deck. With his army in shambles, the young Sultan retreated behind the walls of Delhi. Timur did not give chase. Making camp just outside the walls, Timur decided to wait until the next day to take the city. During that long night, the Sultan snuck away successfully, leaving Delhi to face the Prince of Destruction alone. Timur, if it can be believed, had no intentions of plundering the city, but I really don't think he came all this way for nothing, and soon enough his army began looting Delhi. Not just for 1 or 2 days, but for 15 whole days, the Timurid army plundered every last bit of gold, taking many prisoners, and after the 2 weeks of hell were finished, Delhi wouldn't be considered a city for another 15 years. After razing one of the wealthiest cities in the world, Timur began the journey back to Samarkand, his multiple-mile-long caravan of valuables jingling just behind him. While the Indian campaign was nothing short of a success, Timur chose not to conquer any part of the Delhi Sultanate. It's unknown why, but perhaps Timur did not want the trouble of defeating Hindu rebellions in his empire. Or maybe he just wanted to loot Delhi. Ironically, Timur's descendants would one day rule from the city of Delhi that he had just reduced to rubble. Tamerlane didn't stay in Samarkand for long before going out on the campaign that would forever cement his bloody legacy. When it was all said and done, this 7-year campaign would take Timur to the edges of Asia, where he would kill thousands and imprison one of the most important men in the world. Unsurprisingly, this campaign would start in Georgia. For the past whole decade, the fortress of Alinja withstood a Timurid siege led by Tamerlane's son, Mirhan Shah. Alinja Fort was on top of a mountain and could only be attacked on one side, leaving it nearly impregnable. However, after a decade of grogging siege warfare, it looked as if the Georgians inside might just give up their fight. and that's when King George showed up. In 1398, George VII led an army to lift the siege of Alinja Tower, and just as he had previously defeated the son of Timur, so too would he in 1398. The liberated Alinja could now restore its provisions and prepare to hold off an entire army, hopefully for another decade. Mirhan Shah returned to his father, defeated once again by the King of Georgia. This caused a reaction from Timur, who had only just arrived in Samarkand from his sack of Delhi. Tired of this constant Georgian thorn in his side, Tamerlane assembled a massive army numbering some 140,000 men from across the empire. Surely this could bring King George to his knees. By late 1399, Timur had arrived on the borders of southern Georgia. Showing what happens to those who resist, he once again raided deep into the country, burning village after village. This continued until the early spring of 1400, when Timur decided to finish Georgia once and for all. Tamerlane, while he was seething mad, was still smart enough to avoid a conflict with George VII if he could. So, he wrote to the king and gave him one last chance. The King of Georgia responded by marching his army to a defensive position on the Sagrim River. The Georgian numbers for this battle are unknown, but it surely couldn't have been more than 15,000 men, while Timur's army nearly outnumbered him 10-1. This did not faze these mountain warriors, who held steadfast in their defense as a swarm of cavalry shook the earth and clouds of arrows rained down onto them. Seeing his defeat was imminent, King George eventually withdrew his army and retreated from the field. George could not beat Timur in an open battle, without a miracle, but one thing that could best the predominantly cavalry-based army of Timur was the vast forest and steep mountains of Georgia. With this knowledge, King George evacuated his largest cities and took to the woods with his army, where they would conduct unrelenting guerrilla warfare. Timur did not even give chase to the heavily entrenched Georgians in their forest fortress. Instead, he turned his frustration onto all those who King George could not evacuate with him. Timur sacked Tbilisi again, but had a Napoleon in Moscow moment, as the jewel of Georgia was all but abandoned by its inhabitants. With the forest cut off, Timur moved from city to city, province to province, raising hell wherever he went, destroying churches and livelihoods and leaving starvation behind wherever his army struck. By the end of Timur's Georgian campaign, he had gathered more than 60,000 slaves, depopulating an already small country. When Timur left, King George emerged from his forest, only to see that his country had been utterly ravaged. This is when George VII realized that resistance was simply futile. While Timur probably would have loved to plunder Georgia for the rest of his days, an old rival showed up to cause more trouble: Ahmad Jalayir. For the past few years, the deposed Jalayir had made residence in the Ottoman court of Sultan Bayezid, better known by his incredible nickname of the Thunderbolt. While the Ottomans wished to avoid a battle with Timur, they did want to slow his continued conquest by supporting his rivals on each of their borders. When Ahmad Jalayir arrived in his former lands with a fresh army, Timur knew exactly who to punish. Ahmad Jalayir was easily defeated by the Timurid horde, as before, he retreated into the protection of the Ottoman Empire. If this upstart Anatolian Beylik was going to house his rivals, then Timur was going to make sure that they paid for it. Tamerlane invaded and took the city of Sivas, completely looted it, and buried the garrison alive. The Ottomans only responded by retaking the town once the Prince of Destruction had already left. This was only a warning, a calm before the true storm. After showing Bayezid the destructive capability of the Timurid host, Tamerlane moved south and into the Mamluk-controlled Levant. Just like the Delhi Sultanate, the Mamluks of Egypt were enduring a period of decline. Young and ineffective rulers combined with a weak and unmodernized army to create a failed state. Not only this, but the Mamluks had already angered Timur the Lame. More than a decade ago, Timur had sent ambassadors to the city of Aleppo. Upon arriving, these diplomats were killed. A declaration of war just waiting for Timur to activate. In 1400, Timur started his invasion from the north, taking the city of Antioch without a fight before moving towards Aleppo. The governor of the city decided to confront Timur outside his walls, where he managed to hold him off for 2 days before retreating into Aleppo. Then, Tamerlane destroyed and looted Aleppo, avenging his diplomats by piling the skulls of his victims outside the city in multiple towers of heads. Leaving these foreboding structures behind, Timur pushed down the Levantine coast before reaching the city of Beirut. They refused to surrender, and were therefore met by utter destruction. Continuing south, Timur pushed on to the city of Damascus, where he was once again met by a Mamluk army. This was swiftly dealt with, and they fled the field, leaving Damascus to the mercy of Tamerlane. With one of his largest cities about to be annihilated, the Mamluk Sultan sent an entourage to negotiate for Timur's withdrawal. Notable among them was Ibn Khaldun, a renowned philosopher and historian. The diplomats did manage to bribe Timur for peace with a large sum of gold. But this was only a farce, as Timur continued the siege of Damascus in earnest. And after taking the city, he killed everyone inside. In a disturbing display, Tamerlane told the various religious leaders to house their women and children in their mosques. Once these innocents were inside the safety of the mosques, Timur burned them down. So much for being the defender of Islam. After plundering the rich cities of the Levant, Timur started returning to Samarkand. He would be forced back by none other than Ahmad Jaliyir, who had just retaken Baghdad. Timur quickly reared his army around and retook Baghdad again. Here, his most brutal massacre would occur. He killed everybody inside and naturally made 15 separate towers of skulls outside the city, numbering some 90,000 people. That's about 6,000 human heads per tower. Hereafter, Ahmad Jaliyir never made another serious attempt to undermine Timur the Lame. With his journey home stopped cold, Timur decided to continue his campaign. Going north, he turned to the fields of ashes he had left in Georgia only 2 years ago. In late 1401, Tamerlane arrived on the Georgian doorstep, and soon after, the tower fortress of Alinja fell to him, after holding out for 13 years. King George VII could have retreated into his forest and could have withstood Timur in a guerrilla defense, but at the cost of the innocent, undefended people of his country being murdered and enslaved. King George finally surrendered to Timur and agreed to become his vassal. With all his rivals subdued, Timur had but one man who could prove a challenge. That, of course, being the Thunderbolt, Ottoman Sultan Bayezid. While Timur was bringing Georgia under his heel, Bayezid had attacked and taken Timurid lands in the far east of Anatolia. This caused a flurry of letters between the emir and the sultan. These guys literally did the medieval equivalent of roasting each other, taking turns jabbing at each other's character. But words are only that. Timur, who could neither read nor write, took up the sword to see if Bayezid would stick to his pen. In 1402, Tamerlane invaded the Ottoman Empire for the second time, retaking the land that Bayezid had stolen in the previous year. This left the Ottoman Sultan in quite a bind. While Timur was plundering his eastern holdings, Bayezid was conducting a siege of Constantinople. The Ottomans probably could have taken the last Roman holdout here, if it was not for Timur the Lame. Bayezid reluctantly lifted the siege and marched east in the direction of the Timurids. Bayezid tracked down the Timurid army who had remained in eastern Anatolia, and after a short confrontation he managed to rout his enemy's army and defeat the great nomadic conqueror. The army that Bayezid had just defeated was only a ruse to distract the Sultan from Timur and his main army, which had circled behind Bayezid and began sieging the city of Ankara. Upon learning that he had been outmaneuvered, Bayezid, who got his nickname of the The Thunderbolt, by the speed at which he conducted campaigns, began a full-scale run back to Ankara. The land here was dry and the sun hot. The arid Anatolian steppe gave no water, and only exhausted the Ottoman army. With canteens running low, Sultan Bayezid promised all the water in the world once they reached Ankara and the river that accompanied it. These promises fell through, however, as the Timurid army had diverted a whole river so that the Ottomans could not refill their canteens unless they wished to fall victim to Timurid arrows. This left Bayezid with one option: defeat Timur and get a glass of water, or succumb to dehydration and be defeated anyways. What culminated would be one of the greatest battles in all of history. The two armies lined up, Timur outnumbering his foe by nearly 30,000. The battle began on the Ottoman left, led by Prince Suleiman. To defend the Timurid right was Mirhan Shah and a large contingent of cavalry behind a few dozen elephants. When the two flanks clashed, they matched one another in a brutal melee. After this, Timur ordered a full-scale charge of his army, and as the two armies collided, they were again matched. On the Ottoman right, the Timurid horse and elephant charged the lines of Bayezid's most powerful vassal, Stefan Lazarevich, and his heavily armored Serbian knights. The Serbians managed to push the lightly armored Timurid cavalry back to the point where they looked as if they might break. However, with the rest of Bayezid's army not finding success, the Sultan ordered Lazarevich to return to the lines where the main battle still urged on. At this point, Sultan Bayezid had the upper hand, but what he could not anticipate was his own mercenaries' betrayal. So far, they had remained unengaged on the left flank, but once Timur gave a signal, they crashed into Prince Suleiman's contingent and surrounded it, causing the Ottoman prince to retreat, leaving his father to face Tamerlane. With this, the numbers were firmly in the hands of Timur, who advanced his entire army, only holding his bodyguard back in reserve. In response, the Serbian knights withdrew from the right flank and helped the struggling Ottoman center. After crushing one-third of the Timurid middle in a devastating charge, Stefan Lazarevich made his way to Bayezid, urging him to retreat while the loyal Prince of Serbia held off the Timurid host. Bayezid refused, choosing to defeat Tamerlane or die trying. The Sultan withdrew his entire army, including Prince Lazarevich, allowing them to make a run for it, while Bayezid and his bodyguard lined up on a nearby hill to make their last stand. The Timurids completely surrounded the Sultan and, on Timur's orders, charged their soon-to-be defeated foe. Bayezid now fought side by side with his men for the rest of the day, turning back the Timurid charges in one final heroic display. By nightfall, Bayezid was ready to make his escape. With 300 of his household guards and 2 of his sons, Sultan Bayezid broke the Timurid lines and made a run for it. Escaping the battlefield that should have costed him his life, he urged and pressed his horse forward. The Thunderbolt was proving true to his moniker as he outran the Timurid army. His hopes were, however, dashed when his horse lost its footing and threw Bayezid to the ground. The Sultan was taken prisoner along with his 2 sons, and Bayezid would spend the rest of his life in jail, where by all accounts he was treated well along with his sons. Bayezid would die only a year later at the age of 42, perhaps poisoning himself to deprive Timur of his greatest trophy. After Bayezid's death, Timur released his 2 sons, returning them to an Ottoman Empire that was eating itself alive. With their father gone, the Sultan's sons began fighting over who should be his next successor. This event, known as the Ottoman Interregnum, nearly destroyed the House of Osman and their empire. This devastation lasted for over a decade and was all caused by Timur the Lame. With the Ottoman Empire's central authority shattered, Timur concluded his siege of Ankara before turning his gaze on the whole of the Anatolian peninsula. Going from town to city, he looted and pillaged each and every province, even managing to take the Ottoman capital of Bursa and burning it to the ground. Upon conquering Anatolia, Timur gave all the beyliks who had just fallen to the Ottomans during the reign of Bayezid their independence. This should have ensured that the Ottomans would never pose a threat again. In Timur's lifetime this was true, but the Ottomans would one day rise far past Anatolia and become the hegemon of the Middle East for centuries. With their biggest threat subdued, the Byzantine Emperor Manuel II sent many gifts to his liberator, seeking an alliance with the powerful Tamerlane. Timur declined the offer, knowing a weak ally when he saw it. On top of the Byzantines, the rest of Europe suddenly became very aware of the man who had just crushed the boogeyman of the Balkans. After the Battle of Ankara, Timur held frequent correspondence with the monarchs of Europe, especially Charles VI of France. And by the end of Timur's life, the two would come to ally one another as both defensive and offensive allies. In Timurid lands, Genoan and Venetian traders were also allowed to continue their lucrative businesses, which served to enrich the empire as a whole. For Europeans, Tamerlane, the Prince of Destruction who made towers of skulls out of innocent people's heads, was viewed as a crusading liberator. While we're on the topic of crusaders, the Knights of Rhodes, the final crusader state, was put to siege by Timur. Not on the island of Rhodes, Timur would have been a fool to try to take that stronghold, but on the Knights' mainland holding of Smyrna. The Knights of Rhodes had been preparing to meet the Eurasian warlord since his initial invasion of Anatolia. The defenses were fortified, a massive trench was dug, and ammunition was at an all-time high when Timur arrived on December 2nd of 1402. Timur offered the Crusaders one last chance to surrender on the condition that they convert to Islam. This was, of course, rejected, and the 200 defenders inside were confident that Smyrna could halt any invader. The Rhodian Knights held off multiple attempts to take the fort by employing Greek fire to burn those who attempted to scale the walls. After 2 weeks of a stout defense, Timur's army managed to mine under the walls and place explosives, thus resulting in a huge portion of the wall collapsing, allowing the Timurids to infiltrate Smyrna. While some of the knights held back the eastern horde, most of them got on their boats and sailed back to their headquarters in Rhodes, leaving the civilian population of Smyrna in the hands of Timur, who promptly killed them all. Hereafter, Timur ordered that Smyrna be completely destroyed. On top of conquering vast swathes of the Middle East and Central Asia, Timur had also just defeated the last mainland crusader stronghold. After taking Smyrna and reinforcing his Turkish puppets in Anatolia, Timur wasted no time in going back to what he loved doing the most, plundering and steamrolling Georgia flat into oblivion. King George VII, after his surrender, remained loyal to his Timurid overlord, but he made one crucial mistake. Although this wasn't part of his vassal clause, he had failed to congratulate Timur on his great victory at Ankara. Upon receiving word that Timur had returned to punish Georgia, George VII sent many luxurious gifts to the victor of Ankara. This was only met by Timur besieging the fortress of Birtvisi. This small fort sat on the top of a mountain with steep and unwalkable cliffs on nearly every side. Just looking at Birtvisi, it is clear that this tower would be impossible to take. Wishing to avoid another long, drawn-out siege in Georgia, Timur ordered his best climbers to scale the walls and open the gates. The 150 Georgians inside managed to repel 8 separate attacks before they were overwhelmed and the gates were opened, thereby opening the route for Timur to raid the lands of central Georgia once again. Learning that the Hellgates had just opened, King George VII retreated all the way to his most northern province of Abkhazia. This left the rest of Georgia undefended, and in all, 700 towns, villages, and cities were massacred by Timur the Lame. He only relented when his own men began to feel sorry for the Christians. By 1404, Timur stopped his raids and allowed George VII to continue ruling as one of his many vassal kings. Finally, after more than 20 years and 8 separate invasions, the Georgians would endure their final pillaging from the Prince of Destruction. With Bayezid defeated and dead, the Ottomans in shambles, and Georgia on fire, Timur finally decided to bring an end to his grand 7-year campaign, beginning the journey back to Samarkand in 1404. Tamerlane laid eyes on his flourishing capital on the steppe by 1405. At this point, he was nearing his 68th birthday, but he was still a domineering figure and just as strong mentally as he ever was. While Timur was gone, trouble had been brewing in the north. Edigu, the new leader of the Golden Horde, stripped off his Timurid vassalage and started ruling on his own accord. Although there were no direct conflicts between the Golden Horde and the Timurids at this time, Tamerlane decided to support his old ally and more recent nemesis, the notorious Tokhtamysh. After his defeat on the Terek River, Tokhtamysh had continued in his ceaseless wars to reclaim his seat as Khan. By 1400, his resistance had been pushed all the way to the bleakness that is Siberia. In a desperate last attempt, he called for his old mentor to aid him. Surprisingly, Timur responded by sending him money that allowed Tokhtamysh to hire a group of mercenaries. Tokhtamysh would continue losing and retreating from his failed battles until he was finally killed by a hail of arrows in 1406. While Tokhtamysh and Timur would be fierce rivals for most of their lives, it's good to see that in the end, Timur came to the aid of his younger understudy. In 1405, a short time after arriving in Samarkand, a letter from the Spanish crown arrived in the court of Tamerlane. As it was read out to him, a few words caught his attention, namely, China and revolt. With turmoil consuming the Ming dynasty, this is all the aged Timur needed to know before assembling his army to start his most ambitious campaign yet. Tamerlane planned to raid China and possibly conquer it just as the Mongols had some centuries ago. With his largest army to date, Timur left Samarkand in the middle of winter. An inopportune time for such a faraway campaign, but Timur was in the midst of fighting off the Grim Reaper. Tamerlane took one last look at Samarkand, a city which had not only grown under him, but had prospered into the greatest city in Central Asia. Before he could even leave Timurid lands, he died on February 18th of 1405, at the age of 68. There's no telling what would have happened on this campaign if Timur had lived long enough to lead it. The Ming dynasty was more stable than Timur had been told, but knowing Tamerlane, he probably would have sacked the Chinese countryside until arriving at the walls of Beijing and beheading the emperor. But we can never know. Timur's body was prepared by wrapping it in rose-scented linens, and his body was sent to Samarkand in a shiny black coffin. Here he was buried and left undisturbed for over 500 years, no one daring to release the devil that lay inside. His epitaph reads, "If I come back to life, the world will tremble. Whoever opens my tomb shall unleash an invader more terrible than I." On June 19th of 1941, his final resting place was disturbed by Soviet archaeologists. Perhaps it was the curse of Timur, or just mere coincidence, but 2 days later, the Nazis started Operation Barbarossa and invaded the Soviet Union. What followed was utter destruction on both sides, with over 5 million casualties all combined. The victor of this offensive would be a man born in the hunting grounds of Timur, Georgia. And like Timur, he was crippled in both arm and leg. And like Timur, he was a Eurasian emperor, who killed even more people than the Prince of Destruction himself. Tamerlane was, without a doubt in my mind, an evil man. No one ruled through fear better than him, perhaps until Joseph Stalin. When it was all said and done, Timur had sacked thousands of towns, exterminating 5.4% of the entire population on Earth, numbering some 17 million people in all. These genocidal actions were mostly conducted on a majority Muslim population, all while Timur himself claimed to be the defender of Islam. If we put all of the bloodshed, which is most of his story, to the side, we do see another side to the Prince of Destruction. The only people who Timur spared over his many campaigns was the learned scholars. Every time he came across one, he sent them straight to Samarkand, which quickly led the steppe city to undergo a renaissance. On top of sparing the scholars, Timur also enjoyed talking with them and learning from them. The great conqueror could typically be seen arguing philosophy with some of the brightest minds of his day, showing that Timur was much more than a bloodthirsty tyrant. Although he couldn't read or write, Timur was a highly intelligent, bloodthirsty tyrant who held education to the highest degree. Timur was the last of the great nomadic conquerors, and perhaps the greatest among them. In a dying age where guns were starting to make the horse archers of the steppe obsolete, Timur rose from a simple bandit to become the most powerful man of his day. Truly a story of bloody rags to even bloodier riches. The conqueror of Iran, the warden of Bayezid, the bane of Georgia, and the destroyer of Delhi truly earns his nickname of the Prince of Destruction. Might I remind you that Timur did all of these things while missing 2 fingers and having a crippled leg. So what's your excuse to get off your couch and stop watching YouTube and go conquer the world? And I spent too much time on this script. I just need to go. If you'd like to support this stoic historian, feel free to do so on Patreon for as little as $1 a month, and join Derek Clark and Savak Leo Nazarian, or become a YouTube channel member like Derek Clark again and Donald Vincent. Thank you guys again for supporting the channel. I really appreciate it.